Okay. So the first disclaimer that I want to make about the way this is being presented is that the way these groups are being presented is in a perfect world where organizations and people have all the resources they need to invest in these types of processes to introduce these different types of groups. Many of you who work in the field probably know that, for example, I'll start with what we should start with in a perfect world is a psychosocial support group, then move the person into a treatment group, and then move a person into a process group. But for efficiency and resource reasons, you'll find that often a person can be in a treatment group and a process group all at the same time. So I just want to give this disclaimer. The way this is being presented is if we lived in a perfect world. Okay. So let's start by just talking about how we're going to kind of go through this to kind of make sense of these different types of groups. Okay. What we're exploring is the three types of group we engage in the treatment and helping fields. The first one is psychoeducational groups, and then we will get into treatment group and process group. Okay, and the goal of this is to understand the roles of each of the group in healing from trauma. We're going to specifically look at trauma such as domestic violence, loss and grief, and things dealing with traumas like cancer or medical diagnoses. So we're going to look at a definition of each, look at their key characteristics, and look at their targeted benefits. And then in the end, we'll do a comparison and some case applications for each. Okay. So first, let's start with a psychosocial support group. Okay. Uh, this type of group is a supported group that provides emotional and social support to individuals who are sharing in some traumatic experience. Okay, the two kind of purposes beyond the educational component is to normalize feeling and reduce isolation. Um, we've talked about before how often victims of abuse can feel like they're the only ones who are experiencing this. We see it in the addiction field and those kinds of things. And the one of the goals of a social psychosocial support group is to one see that other people experience what I experience, normalizing, and then also to reduce the isolation. Okay, so very commonly in a psychoeducational group, some examples are, for example, domestic violence survivor groups and grief supports for who someone has lost a loved one. Okay. These groups tend to be either peer led or facilitated by a professional. When they're done by a professional, it's someone in the organization that has kind of the script for group by group topics. When it's peer led, they also have a manualized, this is a topic for each group and whatnot. And the peer led is usually led by someone who has been through the group before and also has lived a life, for example, without abuse or an abuser in their life, or someone who has gone completely through the grief process of losing a loved ones. Another good example of psychoeducational support groups is peer-led AA groups, and also peer-to-peer support programs where someone in mental health. Okay. Um, and the emphasis is really on the shared experience and mutual support, but also there's an educational experience. So what's common for a group like this is, for example, in the domestic survivor group, violent survivor group, you do a check in, see how everyone is doing. Sometimes the facilitator will have like a inspirational quote or something that gets people thinking. They'll do the quote and say, when you do the check in, reflect on this. What does it make you think and feel? To kind of just bring everybody grounded to what they're doing that day. After that, they tend to, then there is usually an educational component. So, very common in the domestic violence field, they'll go through the power and control wheel, and maybe that topic for that day is financial abuse. So, the facilitator will go through what is that and what is the power dynamic, and then they'll go it through and kind of do a process. Who has experienced this and what kind of forms has it come in? The important part of this group, along with that educational component, is a lot of times, especially for example in the power and control group with things like financial abuse, usually when the facilitator is talking about it, the survivor is going, that's me. They see, remember that facilitation of mirroring that we talked about, and they see themselves. The important component though is after the lesson, quote unquote, going around and processing, where the person realizes they weren't the only one. They're not the only one that this happens to. This is a normalized behavior for abusers to use. And it makes them, again, feel less isolated and makes their experience more normalized, that they're not abnormal. That it's really the abuser who is driving them to think crazy, that they're crazy for what they're thinking, and those kinds of things. Okay. So that's kind of the psycho support group. Okay. The treatment group is, this is usually facilitated by a professional who has either licensed or has mental health credentials, has been maybe trained in a certain type of treatment modality, but has some type of professional certification or skill in a, for a certain item, for a certain treatment group or a certain treatment process, or for a specific population. Okay. The focus of a treatment group is therapeutic outcome. Basically, if we were to put it in Western treatment model, it's about symptom reduction. Okay. So it's about reducing the symptoms of PTSD or depression or those kinds of things. Okay. So, for example, and that's the purpose, right, is to address specific symptoms or issues such as PTSD symptoms and depression symptoms. Some examples of this, and we've kind of talked about this throughout the group, throughout this class, I'm sorry, um, is is that the cognitive behavioral therapy, and then and two other really good examples are those two treatment theories in the videos we watched last week. Okay, where there was a structured process, um, and the goal is again about symptom reduction. So example, that last Thursday, the therapist introduced different skills people could use, or the group members could use, to reduce some symptom they were experiencing. So usually in a treatment group, again, you do the check-in, maybe you do a little processing, you see where people's symptomologies are and what they're experiencing right here and right now. And then you go into some type of skill development. So let's talk about, how do I get all these random thoughts in my mind and get rid of them. You might use something called the hallway technique, where you put categories of things people constantly are thinking about, and you teach them to close those doors that aren't important at that moment. Those kinds of kind of compartmentalizing kind of thoughts. Okay. And again, when we talk about, so not beyond mental health, treatment groups can help people who are going through the grief process. So cancer patients addressing anxiety and coping mechanism. So when we mention treatment group, and I think this is an important aspect, not only are we talking about the treatment of some type of mental disorder or a psychological disorder, these uh, treatment groups can also be used to help with some type of trauma, such as dealing with anxiety and coping mechanisms with being diagnosed with cancer. Okay. The key aspect of a treatment group is one, it uses an evidence based therapeutic technique, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, those kinds of things. And there tends to be a structured format. The other aspect of a treatment group that's different from a psychosocial group and even a process group is that there's specific goal oriented and measurable outcomes that you want for your client. So if their anxiety is reduced by using a technique that's goal oriented and it's measurable, you can measure whether or not they reduce their anxiety or not by using that technique. Okay. Now, treatment groups then usually lead to what are known as process group. Okay. Now, again, when I talk about treatment groups, one thing that we need to recognize is that it's about symptom reduction in the here and now. Okay, and uh, and what the evidence shows is that when people deal with their symptoms in the here and now, instead of trying to figure out of the why they're experiencing those symptoms and going into their childhood and all of those kinds of things really does not relieve their anxiety or depression symptoms now. Okay. So a treatment group focuses on the individual in the here and now so that they can function better in the world, and then they can go into a more process group type of situation if they choose to. Okay. So, a process group, so a therapeutic group is a therapeutic group that focus on exploring the emotions, behaviors, and one important aspect of a process group is the interpersonal dynamics of a situation. So often you'll explore, someone might say that they had a bad experience and brought up a lot of emotions and feelings, and another person might say that they're having conflict with their intimate partner. And in a process group, what you want to do is show kind of promote this mutual exchange between group members about what they've experienced and about the tools from the treatment group maybe they might want to consider using. But what a process group is allows an individual to do is to explore more of the why they are experiencing things, but it should be stacked on top of the treatment group that helps them deal with the symptoms that might come up as they're trying to figure out the why. Okay. So the purpose is to create a deepened self awareness so that a person can say, my trauma does not own me. I own my trauma. That's a treatment outcome. And that I understand that trauma happened to me. It's a part of me, but it doesn't control me. That's a deepened self awareness. Because what you often find with addiction, with people with depression, people who are survivors of abuse, is that their total self concept becomes about having that dysfunction in their life. I am the way I am because I was abused. I am the way I am because I am an addict. And if you think about that term, there's no alternatives for this individual. It's a dead end road when a person defines themselves by their mental health condition, by their trauma, by their addiction. So a process group allows them to let go of those things, realize that they will always be a part of them. So, for example, in an addiction, you commonly hear once an addict, always an addict. But that doesn't mean the person has to be defined by it. That was an experience they had in their life. It's a risk for them to go back to that, but there's so much more about them than just that addiction. Okay. And then also to enhance emotional expression and relational skills. Um, and this really comes from the social dynamics of experiencing trauma and experiencing addiction and experiencing surviving any type of trauma and mental health condition, is that in the world that they lived in pre-treatment, they may have destroyed their relationships. They may have exhausted their relationships, and so in the process group, it's really about helping the individuals rebuild those relationships and identifying those relationships that they should probably not rebuild. Okay. So, some examples again, and we've already talked about these, for survivors of domestic violence, a process group might aim towards healing the emotional wounds. Um, and for patients, it's navigating the complex feelings about having a cancer diagnosis. The key feature about a process group and what makes um, this group the most complex is that it does require the facilitator to have the full set of skills that are fully developed that we talked about in this class. Because really, a process group is an open ended discussion group. And the facilitator has to then navigate how that processing is going to occur, what needs to be addressed immediately, what should be the focus of the group when maybe you have a group of 9 people and they all need to process 9 different things. As a facilitator, you have to find those common themes in those 9 different topics to say, okay, this may help us all. Let's discuss X, Y, and Z. Okay. And so that's the second point in the key feature, is focusing on the group dynamics and interaction. Again, another important part of the process group is teaching individuals who have gone through all of these things we've talked about how to interact with other people in a healthy way, okay, and in a trusting way as well. So those are the key aspects of a process group. All right. Okay. So just kind of summarize this, we can use this table here. We could look at facilitation, focus, and structure and goal. So when we look at a psychosocial support group, we're looking at it's peer-led or professional-led. It's there for emotional support and shared experience and education. I should put that in there as well. It tends to be flexible and discussion based. And again, the main goal beyond the educational component is normalization and connection. Okay. We counter that with we compare that with the treatment group and the process group. Both the treatment group and process group should be ran by a trained professional, someone who has gone through very specific training for the type and modality of that group, and is well trained. Now, the difference between treatment and process is in treatment, it's about symptom reduction and skill building, whereas process group is about emotional processing and relational dynamics. Okay. In the structure, treatment groups tend to be highly structured and intervention based. Okay. So they tend to have very specific goals. They tend to again tend to be measurable, and those types of things. In a process group, they can be semi-structured, and but they're very much interaction based. Okay, and then again, when we look at the goal, we're when with a treatment group, we're looking at symptom management and measurable outcomes. In a process group, we're looking at emotional insight and personal growth. Okay, so those are the three types of groups. Um, and some of the applications, again, psychosocial support group tends to provide safe place for survivors, for example, of trauma. Treatment groups are good at addressing trauma symptoms, and process groups are about exploring trust, self-esteem, and relational patterns post abuse. These are all applications for domestic violence. Okay. Oops. When we look at loss of a loved one, a psychosocial group is good for grief sharing that normalize the mourning process. Treatment groups is interventions for complicated grief or depression. So symptomologies that make it so the individual isn't able to function. And process group allows for discuss and process unresolved feelings about the loss that it experiences. Okay. When we look at groups for cancer diagnoses, okay, the main focus for psychosocial support groups is peer support to navigate shared challenges. Treatment groups tend to focus on the anxiety and emotional resilience. And then the process group is about exploring those existential questions. And with a cancer diagnosis comes identity change. You're introducing something that is new to this individual's identity that isn't so positive. And so, how does that affect them? Because people are going to look at themselves and they're going to define themselves different with that diagnosis. So, in conclusion, each group type addresses some unique aspect of trauma recovery. Okay. So, psychosocial support groups foster connection, treatment targets symptoms, process promotes deep emotional healing. Okay. And a key takeaway for this is understanding the distinctions ensures appropriate group placement for a trauma survivor. Okay. And I will say this fairly quickly up front. It is inappropriate to place someone who has never gone through treatment in immediately into a process group. And there are times that are appropriate that you'll find that you may need to take a person out of a process group and put them back into a psychosocial or treatment modality because they haven't been able to manage their symptoms yet. And that deep emotional processing that you do during process group can be highly disruptive, not only for that individual who hasn't learned to deal with their symptoms or to manage them or to heal from them, but it then can have a triggering effect on everyone else in that process group. Okay. So those are all kind of things to consider when you're looking at placement. Okay. So I think that's it on that. So what I'm going to do is I want to stop our recording and